What started out as a series of films made about pulp and serial superheroes has really turned into a series on superhero movies that are really hard to look at critically. Last week when I reviewed The Phantom, I said that it wouldn't make sense to hold it to modern conventions of storytelling because its goal was to recapture the adventure and the innocence of the movie serials. And The Rocketeer had the same complication to a different degree. So now we get to Dick Tracy, which isn't quite what you'd expect. I'm admittedly not an avid reader of the Dick Tracy comic strip, but reading up on it, it's nearly entirely faithful to its source material as far as I can tell. So it does exactly what The Phantom did with serials. It tries to recapture the essence of a comic strip and put it on screen. While The Phantom bordered on parody, Dick Tracy fits squarely in the category of live-action cartoon, and so it too follows a different set of rules from the conventions of modern storytelling. It opened to mixed reviews, and among some of the criticisms were that it's boring and its characters aren't very well fleshed out. They don't seem like real people. But it wouldn't be fair to overly criticize the live-action versions of Popeye, the Flintstones, or Scooby-Doo for having archetypical characters when the cartoon world is one of archetypes. I realize Dick Tracy didn't start as a cartoon, but the comic strip, while not laugh-out-loud, slapstick-type comedy, certainly includes a lot of the same elements of a funny cartoon, particularly the cat-and-mouse chase. The only real difference between Dick Tracy and properties like Tom and Jerry, Sylvester and Tweety, or Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote is that we're actually rooting for the guy who's doing the chasing. Like with all formulaic cartoons, we always know who's going to win. The fun is in seeing it unfold. While Tweety always gets away from Sylvester, Dick Tracy always gets the bad guy. They're detective stories, but it's not really about the mystery, and the movie's no different. It's Dick Tracy versus the mob, a classic gangster movie if the gangsters were all over-the-top cartoon characters who all lived in a bizarre world of clashing primary colors that weirdly seemed to revolve around one police officer in a yellow coat and hat. The fact that all the characters in Dick Tracy are archetypes isn't a problem. That's the whole idea. It's a comic strip that used the real, scary Chicago mobs and turned them into something simpler, something fun to read, and most importantly, a trend we're starting to see with these pulp characters, an escape from reality. There's nothing realistic about Dick Tracy, and that's the whole point of him. So let's go ahead and get this out of the way. Dick Tracy isn't really a superhero. He doesn't even work outside the law. He has a badge. He works for money. The success of this movie comes off the heels of Tim Burton's Batman, showing that comic book or comic strip characters were starting to be seen as potentially valid properties again for Hollywood movies in the early 90s. But what's Dick Tracy doing in Superhero Rewind? Well, I thought it would be interesting to look at his influence on the superhero genre and what he has in common with superheroes. While he doesn't strictly fit the definition, Dick Tracy certainly feels like he belongs in the same sentence as Batman. First, he doesn't wear a superhero costume, but he has a unique outfit that's instantly recognizable. Second, he has a trademark gadget, just like other non-superpowered crime fighters, in this case, a radio wristwatch. Third, although he is a law enforcement officer, he sometimes takes the law into his own hands. At several points in the movie, he's warned by the police chief and by the district attorney to follow the rules, as he's prone to doing whatever's necessary to get the job done, though he's no Jack Bauer. He breaks and enters, he makes arrests without warrants, and he illegally coerces information out of prisoners during interrogations. Fourth, there are several typical superhero plot points in Dick Tracy, including having a girlfriend he's in danger of alienating because of his profession, endangering said girlfriend because of his profession, and having to save his girlfriend from kidnapping. Fifth, he ends up with a kid's sidekick. And lastly, and most important, he has a colorful rogues gallery. In fact, Dick Tracy has the first rogues gallery reminiscent of supervillains. Of course, none of these guys have powers, but they all have some sort of gimmick and they're called by nicknames, usually a physical descriptor of an unusual physical deformity or character trait. This, of course, comes out of the tradition of mob bosses with tough guy nicknames. Among the bosses and thugs that appear in the film are Lips, Littleface, Flat Top, which was one of the more famous characters from the comic strip, Mumbles, Pruneface, and the film's main antagonist, Big Boy. Of course, this greatly influenced Batman, who has a rogues gallery that, like Dick Tracy's, is filled with villains with weird motifs and physical deformities, many of which became criminals largely because of what they look like. Most of Batman's villains are insane, while Dick Tracy's are all in the mob, and some of them might be insane too, but their psychology isn't explored enough to even know that much. They look like grotesque monsters, and so, in the world of Dick Tracy, it just stands to reason that they'd all be part of the criminal underworld. After all, who else would have them? These kinds of bad guys are found all over The Tick, which parodied all kinds of comic book motifs, and I'm reminded of the episode from the animated series The Tick vs. Science, in which Chairface Chippendale tries to get his hands on a mind-switching device. He asks his henchmen if any of them is less than happy with the body fate felt fit to hand them, and every one of them raises their hands, including Dean, a man with a screw for a head. This movie is all about atmosphere and creating a strange world that only bears passing resemblance to reality. At the time, no movie had ever come close to this kind of stylized comic book world on film. A year earlier, Batman was praised for its gothic, heightened reality, but Dick Tracy takes that even further. The characters all wear suits that look like they were designed with Easter egg colors in mind, and the buildings are much the same way. The architecture is simple and box-like, and it really does look exactly like what you'd expect from a real-life version of the comic strip. The matte paintings are especially impressive. While it's obvious they're drawings, and that might detract from suspending disbelief in another film, I think it works here even better than CGI would have, even if we'd been able to do that in 1990, because this is a world that's supposed to look drawn. In every respect, from the set designs to the melodramatic dialogue in the romance sequences, to the brilliant prosthetics that make the strange, deformed villains come to life, the audience is sucked into this ultra-stylized universe. Having an all-star cast helps a lot because everyone plays it straight. There's nothing tongue-in-cheek about this. They all think their world is normal, to the point where, in the third act, when Dick Tracy tells the police force about No Face, one of the cops says, "If Dick Tracy says there's a guy with no face, there's a guy with no face." Considering what other deformities are possible here, nobody even gives it a second thought. And one of my favorite lines in the film is when Tracy says to a member of the press with an unnaturally long nose, "You should shave off that ridiculous mustache." Danny Elfman's score also helps to elevate this bizarre fantasy into something that feels credible. His music is unmistakably Elfman, but it sounds more like the music from a radio serial than it does like Batman. It's also interesting that the theme is very similar to his theme from the Flash TV series released the same year. As I alluded to earlier, Dick Tracy's appeal seems to be as much about his villains as it is about Dick Tracy himself, and Big Boy gets as much, if not more, screen time than Dick Tracy does. He's played by the great Al Pacino, who, like the rest of the cast, obviously had a blast making this movie. He's the most stereotyped mob boss there is, and the film's funniest moments come from him. He has no redeemable qualities. He's thirsty for power, wanting to control all the bosses. He kills other bosses to get their territory. He tries to bribe Dick Tracy, and when he refuses, he tries to kill him in a big elaborate death trap. But he's so goofy, he's almost likable. Again, cartoon character. He never shuts up, and what he says is hilarious. There's a great running gag where he keeps quoting and misquoting famous historical figures, from Ben Franklin to Lincoln to Plato. He's a mock sophisticate, and he's doing anything he can to look respectable. Sometimes it has nothing to do with anything, like toward the end when he uses Tracy's girlfriend Tess to lure Tracy to him, and he tells her, "Plato agrees with me. There is and what we would like there to be." But that's not important. He also naturally has a huge ego, and in trying to run the entire mob, he says, "There was one Napoleon, one Washington, and one me." While the plot seems a little complicated and even sometimes a little convoluted, as I said, it's essentially a cat-and-mouse game of Big Boy trying to take over the mob and Tracy gradually figuring out what he's up to and taking him down. It's a series of one-ups between the two of them. Tracy figures out that Big Boy's running illegal gambling establishments. Then Big Boy finds ways to disguise his establishments as legitimate clubs and no one can prove it. Dick Tracy can bring him down if witnesses will testify against him, but Big Boy has the DA in his pocket, the DA played by none other than Dick Van Dyke. Tracy puts moles at Big Boy's establishments and starts getting enough proof to shut them down, so Big Boy ends up making a deal with the mysterious No-Face, which results in Tracy getting blackmailed for killing the DA, and so on and so forth, until Big Boy is finally brought down at the end and gets killed in typical comic book movie style. Dick Tracy himself is a character largely without personality. He's a no-nonsense detective who lives for his work and is 100% devoted to it. Naturally, he's also the best there is. He's played to perfection here by Warren Beatty, who also produced and directed the film. Beatty is the character right off the page, though with perhaps a little more heart, especially when it comes to his relationship with a kid he pulls off the street who doesn't want to go back to foster care. Ultimately, he ends up saving Tracy from a death trap, gets an honorary detective certificate, and only goes by Kid. At first, if you don't know anything about the comic strip, it might seem like having a punk kid Tracy's forced to interact with is a cheap subplot in lieu of any better ideas, but in fact, he's a main character from the strip who is adopted by Tracy and becomes known as Dick Tracy Jr. One of the best scenes in the film is when he finally chooses a name, as the police chief tells him his detective certificate only becomes permanent if he has a real name, so he chooses to name himself after Dick Tracy, who's taken care of him like a father. It's interesting because he's not at all a sentimental character, Dick Tracy. He seems to just do the decent thing in every situation because that's his code of conduct. He breaks the rules, but only when he thinks he has to. And while he beats up the bad guys in fistfights just like your average superhero, and the bad guys throw around terms like police brutality, the movie, just like the comic strip, seems to always side with Tracy. If he doesn't follow the rules, it's because that's the right thing to do in that situation. And the reason no one else is as good as he is because he knows when to break the rules. Because while he is pushing the limits of what he can do as a cop, he also tells the kid he has to turn him over to welfare because it's the law. By the end, of course, he takes the kid in. And I like their dynamic. They don't say a lot to each other, and their relationship is understated, but you can tell that the kid is growing on Tracy as the movie progresses, and there's never that annoying scene where the hero finally begins to tolerate the irritating kid after days of barely being able to stand him. You get the sense that the kid's an inconvenience, but it's just a given for Tracy that he's helping him. That's part of why, though definitely an archetype, Dick Tracy is pretty likable. Of course, in a gangster movie, you've got to have the dame who walks the line between criminal and good guy. She has information that can be used against Big Boy, and Dick Tracy wants her to testify, but all she seems to want is an affair with Dick Tracy. We discover by the end that she is in fact disguising herself as No-Face to try and take control of the mob herself, but Tracy is the irresistible hero, and so she can't help but fall in love with him. Breathless Mahoney is played by Madonna and is written as a Marilyn Monroe knockoff. Madonna does okay with the role, but she's mostly just there to try and seduce Tracy, cause tension with his girlfriend Tess, and sing lounge numbers behind montage sequences. Her character is certainly necessary to round out all the archetypes, but Madonna's not as strong an actor as everyone she's paired with, so while she looks like the perfect casting choice for this period, she is kind of the weak link in this star-studded cast. Dick Tracy dances around a character arc, but he's ultimately the same at the end as he is in the beginning. And really, that's the whole idea. His inner conflict is about balancing his personal life with his professional life, or more to the point, trying to decide if he even wants a personal life. Detective work is everything to him. He loves the thrill and the adventure. He's not sure he wants to settle down with Tess because he doesn't want to lose that. But he doesn't want to lose her either, so toward the beginning of the film, he tries to ask her to marry him, or maybe just to move in with him. At the time, it's hard to tell. The line he feeds her is they both like living alone, and they have that in common, so since they're so alike, maybe they should, but he can never finish that sentence. And she won't finish it for him, because what he does is so dangerous. Like many superheroes, Dick Tracy's crime-fighting lifestyle isn't conducive to a family. Breathless Mahoney represents the exciting life he could have without having to settle down. But he can't trust her, something that's brought up every time they're on screen together. He couldn't be happy dating around with girls like that. He wants something solid in his life, even if he can never truly settle down. There's a scene where Tess catches Breathless kissing Tracy, but it's obvious that while she is tempting, Tess is who he really wants. But there's always going to be tension between them because of his lifestyle. This was a regular theme in the comic strip too, and perhaps that's partly why he takes in this kid. It makes him feel more normal, having to take care of someone else, having to be a father. He likes responsibility, but he struggles, as I'm sure many people in adventurous fields do, with whether he likes action more than he likes real companionship. By the end of the film, some things have changed for Tracy. He has a surrogate son, and he's asked Tess to marry him. Kind of. He throws her the ring and says, "You're 1 in a million." But the actual question is never asked, and so it's never answered, and we're reminded that we're essentially just seeing one episode in a serialized world. Tess and Tracy have nearly the same exchange at the end as they do in the beginning, about how they both live alone, and about how they have that in common. I wonder if maybe they've had this conversation several times before. Maybe, even though there's a ring now, they still won't make up their minds and they'll have this conversation again. I think the idea is that this is a world where things don't really change. The characters keep dealing with the same conflicts, and Tracy keeps bringing the bad guys to justice. And that's how the comic strip works. Dick Tracy Jr., being the one major thing in Tracy's life that does change, is just set up for the regular status quo in this universe. A sequel was never made due to copyright issues, but were this serialized like a comic strip, the ring at the end would be there to keep us watching, teasing us that maybe someday they'll get married, but it probably won't be this episode or even next episode. And after years of teasing the readers in the comic strip, one day they did get married. To a younger audience now, I doubt if this movie would make the same impact it did on me when I first saw it. Since Dick Tracy, we've had such ultra-stylized movies as Sin City and Watchmen that allows filmmakers to be visually truer to comic books than was ever possible before last decade. But in 1990, Dick Tracy was really visually striking, and Beatty wasn't afraid to take risks. It pushed the boundaries of translating one medium into another, and though it's rarely credited as a pioneering film, I'd wager it's been at least in the backs of the minds of movie makers doing the more visually over-the-top comic book adaptations since then. I'm going to give Dick Tracy a 3.5 out of 4. Next week is Easter weekend, so I'll be out of town, but I'll be back in 2 weeks when I'll take a look at a sort of proto-superhero with Mask of Zorro. Then the week after that, by popular demand, the Thomas Jane version of The Punisher. Thanks as always for watching and commenting, and stay tuned for more.